Hello everybody and welcome back to another video on the channel and welcome to another episode of Keyframed. Now a couple of things before we get started. First of all, I am trying for the first time to record at night instead of during the day, so hopefully this turns out okay. Basically, whenever I record during the day, because I'm right in front of a window, the light tends to fluctuate sometimes and it's a nightmare to try to fix in post. So I thought recording at night maybe would help with the situation, so I'm using some custom lights that you can't see that are off screen at the moment, just to try to help the situation. So we'll see if that changes anything, if it looks better. If it does, then honestly I might have to start recording at night. The other thing is, you might notice I have a new thing on my setup. I say new, it's been here since the beginning, I just never used it. It's a race car lamp that I have on my setup that lights up and it changes color and stuff like that. It looks pretty cool. I don't know if it looks any cool in this video. Obviously it's kind of a little bit out of frame, but it just provides a little bit of color, so I thought I would try it, see how it looks, and yeah, if it looks cool then I'll keep it in the future videos, because why not? I mean, a little interest and cool element to the setup, I guess. So there we go. So for today's episode, I wanted to do something that is maybe more aimed at people who are newer to animation or are thinking about going into animation, because I wanted to talk about the animation pipeline. Specifically the pipeline working on smaller projects, and specifically using my experience working on like student productions as a sort of backbone for this. So hopefully this will be interesting and entertaining. One thing I should mention is that I'm going to be focusing on a 3D film pipeline, because that's all I've been working on, just 3D films. A 2D pipeline would look similar, have maybe some slight differences. The other thing I also want to mention is that although this might have some similarities with the feature film pipeline, it's probably not exactly the same. So any good pipeline will be split into 3 major sections. We have pre-production, production, and post-production. Those are the 3 major aspects of the pipeline that you need to know. Now I'm going to go into each one specifically, but the one thing you need to know is that a lot of the teams that work in each part of the pipeline will actually overlap. So I'm going to be talking about things in a very sequential manner, but I will also be putting up a little graphic that I made that hopefully shows you how the teams work at the same time. Let's start with pre-production. Pre-production, in my opinion, is where a film or project can be made or broken, because so much of the film rides on a good pre-production phase. Pre-production is typically the phase that will last the longest on a film, just because so much happens in pre-production. So in my opinion, you can break down pre-production into 4 individual parts. The first part is what I like to call the story team. Now the story team is going to be responsible for writing the script, coming up with the story beats and the dialogue and all that stuff. And then you'll also have a team of storyboarders who are going to storyboard the entire thing and create a sort of animatic of the project, so that you have an idea of what your shots are going to look like, a very rough idea of what your timing is going to be like, and where your cuts are going to be. It's a very important thing to make so that you can use it in the later parts of the pipeline as a sort of guide to make sure that there's a good consistency. Alongside this, you will also have what I like to call the visual development team, which is going to be comprised of some 2D artists and some illustrators, but also you will get some 3D artists as well as animators who will hop on that team. What this team is responsible for is to basically create the designs for any sort of assets for the film. This goes from something as simple as a character to environments, props, or really anything you're going to be seeing on screen at one point. At the same time, this team is also responsible for coming up with what I like to call the look of the film. This is where a team of 2D and 3D people are going to work together to try to come up with things. You need to be able to come up with it in 2D, but then have some 3D people be able to transfer it into 3D to see how it's going to look before you really put a ton of effort into developing, your final assets. But yeah, so that is the second team, and really those 2 teams are going to be the first 2 teams working, and they're going to be working at the same time with one another. It's really important because the story team is going to influence the designs of the visual development team, but then at the same time, the visual development team, whatever they come up with, the storyboarders need to have it so that the storyboards are accurate to the designs that are actually going to be in the film. So the third team in the pre-production phase is what I like to call the asset development team. This is going to be comprised of modelers, either for characters, environments, or props, some riggers to be able to rig any props or characters that need to be rigged, as well as texturing / surfacing artists that are going to be responsible for creating the textures and surfaces for the different 3D models. This phase is super critical because you need to be able to develop quality assets at a really good and fast rate so that you don't waste too much time on the development and you have more time for the actual production side. Honestly, in my opinion, this is one of the most stressful parts. If your models aren't good or if your rigs aren't good, that's severely going to impact how well you can animate and how well your renders are going to look in the long term. To be fair, every part of the pipeline is stressful, but this to me is very stressful because so much of the film rides on you really succeeding at doing this specific step of the pipeline. For me, the final team in pre-production is what I like to call the layout / previs team. As soon as the story team kind of wraps up their work and they have a finished animatic, it's time for the layout / previs team to hop on and actually start making the shots in 3D. They will be using all the assets that are being created by the asset creation team to stage the environments by putting the props, the characters into a scene and then adding the cameras that match, the storyboards and the animatic to try to get a feel of how the shots are going to look in 3D. Staging is one aspect of previs, but then the other aspect is you'll actually get some people to rough animate the characters and the props that need to be animated in order to get a rough idea of what it's going to look like in motion, and it starts to give you an idea of what the timing is going to be like in 3D. It gives you also an idea of what shots maybe looked really good in 2D, but then in 3D they don't turn out so good, so you might have to make some slight adjustments. This phase is super important, but also very tricky because you want to spend enough time to set up the shots for success for the animation and the further steps of the pipeline, but you also don't want to spend too long on it and slow down the rest of the pipeline. At this point, it's time to move into the second step of the pipeline, production. One important note to make is that although the asset creation team will be doing most of their work in pre-production, they will also be, some of them, still working during production. Mainly the riggers who will be there in case rigs have problems or need to be slightly adjusted, because when you start really going into animation, rig problems are always going to come up, and so you have to have riggers on hand to be able to fix any sort of issues really quickly. So it's super important for them to still be around at this point. The other thing is, in at least the productions that I've been on, texturing and the surfacing artists have continued to work during the production phase, because typically texturing will start very late in pre-production, so you will have to bleed it into production a little bit. So although this is still happening from pre-production, the main part of production is the actual animation. This is where your animators are really going to be working their hardest, because this is when they'll be animating all the shots and try to get all of the animation done before post-production. Animation can take a very long time, especially if you really want it to be quality, and that's why usually the animation team is working really hard and almost non-stop. During the entirety of the production phase, you'll see animators working tirelessly to get their animation done on time. Finally, the last little bit that tends to happen at the same time during production, you have two teams that start working in production that will be finishing in post-production. That is the lighting and simulation / effect team. So although the lighting team will have worked with the visual development team to try to come up with the look of the film and things like that, you'll have them really hop on at this point, and this is when any shots that get finished will be immediately sent to the lighting team for them to be able to actually light the shots. They don't necessarily have to have the lighting done at the end of the production phase. They can kind of bleed over into the post-production phase, but it's super important for the lighting team to start at this point so that they can get a head start and really maximize the time, because if a shot's done animating, it's kind of stupid to not have someone already work on the next phase if it's just sitting there. So that's why the lighting team kind of hops on at this point, as well as once the animation is done, you typically see the effects team also hopping on at this point. If you have any sort of simulations or anything like that, they can already use the animation that's done to already build their simulations and work on that. So those two teams will be starting at that point. They have a little bit of freedom to be able to work into post, but they'll want to get the bulk of the work done in production to not slow down the post-production phase. So the last step of the pipeline is post-production. Now, post-production is mainly about finishing the lighting and the effects and doing all of the rendering. So the rendering phase can kind of start in production, but typically the bulk of the rendering will happen in post. So then once you do that, it'll be time to actually start compositing. This is where you take your renders, your effects, any sort of extra elements you need to add to a shot, and then you will just composite everything together, do some nice color correction, and just make the shots really look super pretty for the final film. One thing that is kind of happening also throughout the entirety of the pre-production, production, and post-production phase is your editing team will be working on the cut constantly. So they'll be really starting with whatever the animatic is, and then taking the animatic and using the previous shots in there to try to build out the cut and continue to update it with any new animation so that you have a constant updated cut going. By the time you hit post-production, then you start having your lit shots in there, your composited shots. You can get a really good idea of what your cut is going to be like. At least on the projects that I've worked on, it's pretty common that you'll hit a point at the end of the production phase called picture lock, where your shots will be kind of locked in. You won't really do any more crazy cuts and things like that. You'll just be adding finalized shots in there. Another thing also that's happening at the same time, and that's going to be, mainly happening in post-production, is all the sound element. If you have any dialogue, obviously you typically would have some dialogue recorded ahead of time so you can animate to it, especially if you have any lip sync. But the music and sound effects, although they'll be probably starting to work in the production phase, the post-production phase is where they're really going to be working hard to get that done. And that's when you'll be adding all your music, all your sound effects, and really getting the mix of visual and audio absolutely correct. So once you've done all that, pretty much you have a finished film. Now, I could go into much more detail about each step of the pipeline, and there's obviously differences depending on the project and depending on the type of project you're working on. So what I'm saying may vary for the project that you're working on or things like that. But I think this is a pretty good general idea of how at least a 3D film functions and how the pipeline functions for a 3D film. So there we go. That was my explanation and breakdown of the animation pipeline for smaller projects. I tried to drop in my experience in there working on those types of projects to give you as much an overview of what the pipeline is like. I hope you will find it interesting and that you learn something from it. If something didn't quite make sense, or if you have any questions about it, please feel free to drop them down below or reach out to me in private. Totally open and would love to answer any questions you have. If you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe to the channel. We've been steadily growing the channel. It's been great. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video. I will see you all very soon for our next video. Thank you so much and see you very soon. Peace.